My name is Tessa, and at 27 years old, I watched the heavy scent of pine and impending snow hang thick in the freezing air of Lake Tahoe as the front doors of our family estate swung open with a deafening thud. I stood on the porch, watching my older brother toss my worn leather suitcase onto the driveway like it was nothing more than a bag of trash, while he stood there with a predatory smirk. He clutched the waist of his new wife, Savannah, who looked down at me from her designer heels with a gaze so sharp it could have cut through the mountain fog. My brother stepped forward to look me in the eye with pure contempt as he coldly told me that the guest rooms were now reserved for people who actually mattered, so I could either rot in the dusty storage shed or simply get out of his sight forever. I looked past them into the warm glow of the foyer where my parents stood, but they merely shared a mocking smile before turning their backs on me to retreat into the comfort of the lion's den. I walked to my car in total silence without shedding a single tear, because they had no idea that the very silence they forced upon me was actually the beginning of their own downfall. As I gripped the steering wheel and felt the engine hum to life, I glanced at the locked briefcase on the passenger seat while knowing that the frantic calls would start flooding in exactly 1 week from today. If you want to find out why my brother will be begging for my mercy in just 7 days, and what secret I am carrying away from this house, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you do not miss the moment the Miller Empire begins to crumble. The icy wind blowing off the surface of Lake Tahoe 15 years ago felt exactly like the cold indifference that permeated every corner of our massive stone villa. I remember sitting at the very end of the long mahogany dining table while watching Dad pour a glass of expensive vintage wine for Austin to celebrate his acceptance into an elite private boarding school. My parents had spent months meticulously preparing his application and donating large sums of money to ensure his future success, while they completely ignored the fact that my own school supplies were falling apart. When I tentatively brought up the subject of needing new textbooks for my advanced placement courses, Mom simply glanced at me with an annoyed expression before telling me that I should learn to be more resourceful like my brother. Austin sat there with a smug grin on his face because he knew that he was the only one in the house whose ambitions actually mattered to the Miller family legacy. Education was not the only battlefield where the lines of favoritism were drawn with such painful clarity during our formative years in Nevada. I had spent an entire summer meticulously building a complex architectural model for a regional competition that I hoped would finally earn me a shred of respect from Dad. One afternoon, while I was away at the library, Austin decided to host a chaotic party with his friends and ended up smashing my entire project into thousands of tiny wooden splinters. When I returned home and found the wreckage of my hard work scattered across the floor, I ran to my parents with tears stinging my eyes to demand some form of justice. Dad did not even look up from his financial newspaper as he calmly stated that boys will be boys, and that I was being far too dramatic over a simple hobby. Mom actually had the audacity to scold me for making a scene in front of their guests, while she patted Austin on the shoulder to comfort him for having his fun interrupted by my sobbing. However, amidst the crushing loneliness of that house, I found a secret sanctuary in the private study belonging to my grandmother Lorraine. She was a formidable woman who had built a significant portion of the family wealth through her own sharp wit, and she was the only person who saw the hidden fire burning inside me. Lorraine would call me into her room late at night to show me complex land deeds and financial ledgers that Dad thought were far too complicated for a young girl to understand. She taught me how to read the fine print of property contracts and explained why certain seemingly worthless plots of land held the power to topple entire empires if managed correctly. We spent hours hunched over those dusty documents while she whispered that true power did not come from shouting at the dinner table, but from holding the cards that no one else knew existed. Lorraine often warned me that the Miller family was building a house of cards on a foundation of pure arrogance that would eventually lead to their spectacular downfall. She once gripped my hand tightly while looking toward the hallway where Austin was bragging about his latest expensive car, and she told me that a dynasty without humility is destined to crumble under its own weight. My grandmother made me promise that I would never reveal the extent of the financial knowledge she was gifting me until the moment when the family's pride finally outstripped their bank accounts. She secretly funneled a small portion of her personal savings into a private trust for me because she knew that Dad would never provide me with the capital I needed to start my own life. The contrast between our lives became even more glaring during the prestigious gala events that my parents hosted for the influential elite of Northern California and Nevada. I was frequently relegated to the role of an unpaid assistant or forced to remain in the shadows of the kitchen to ensure that I did not distract anyone from Austin's rehearsed speeches. Mom would spend thousands of dollars on custom-tailored suits for my brother, while she expected me to wear outdated hand-me-downs that did not even fit my frame properly. On the rare occasions that I was allowed to mingle with the guests, Dad would introduce Austin as the future of the company, while barely acknowledging my presence at all. I learned to navigate those crowded rooms like a ghost while listening to the whispered secrets of businessmen and taking mental notes that would one day become my greatest weapons. Despite the constant efforts to diminish my spirit, the lessons I learned from Lorraine provided me with a quiet strength that none of them could ever hope to extinguish. I watched Austin grow more entitled and reckless with every passing year as he leaned heavily on the safety net that our parents had so carefully constructed for him. While he was out wasting money at luxury resorts, I was secretly studying the market trends and identifying the legal loopholes that governed the very land our house was built upon. The prophecy that Lorraine shared with me regarding the inevitable collapse of the Miller pride began to feel more like an impending reality than a distant warning. I understood that my role in this family was never meant to be the golden child, but rather the silent architect, who would be standing tall when the walls finally came tumbling down. The day I graduated as valedictorian from the university was the exact moment I chose to vanish from the suffocating influence of the Miller family forever. I packed my meager belongings and moved to San Francisco without leaving a forwarding address or answering a single desperate phone call from my parents. While Austin was busy occupying his new corner office at the family headquarters, I was quietly establishing an anonymous investment fund designed to dismantle everything he touched. I operated behind a complex web of shell companies and legal fronts because I knew that being a ghost was the only way to strike at the heart of their arrogance. My primary focus was the aggressive acquisition of distressed debt portfolios that were directly linked to the Miller Group's failing real estate ventures. Austin had officially taken over the daily operations of the family empire and immediately began making catastrophic strategic blunders in the Lake Tahoe region. He was obsessed with a massive luxury development project that required more liquid capital than the company actually possessed at the time. Instead of listening to seasoned advisors, he doubled down on high-interest loans and risky bridge financing, while Dad blindly supported every reckless decision he made. I spent my nights analyzing their public filings and identifying the exact banks that were growing weary of Austin's inability to meet his financial obligations. It was a slow and methodical process that required absolute patience, while I waited for the perfect moment to tighten the noose around their golden legacy. The first time I saw Savannah after leaving home was at a high-end charity auction in the city where she was flaunting a diamond necklace that cost more than a modest house. She spotted me near the back of the room and immediately walked over with a condescending smirk that told me she still viewed me as a pathetic outcast. Savannah took great pleasure in loudly wondering how I could afford to even step foot in such a prestigious venue while mocking my simple professional attire. She told me that Austin had finally cleansed the family of my negative influence and that I should be grateful for whatever crumbs of a life I had managed to scrape together. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression while she spewed her insults because she had no idea that my firm had just purchased the mortgage on her favorite vacation home. The weight of my isolation would have been unbearable if it were not for the constant support of my best friend Leo, who acted as my silent partner in this corporate war. Leo was a brilliant data analyst who had access to internal market movements that were invisible to the general public, or even to the Miller Group's primary investors. He was the one who provided me with the crucial information regarding Austin's secret attempts to refinance the Lake Tahoe project through predatory lenders. We would sit in our small office overlooking the bay while documenting every illegal shortcut and ethical violation that Savannah was committing in her role as a brand consultant. Leo never questioned my desire for absolute severance from my family because he had witnessed the scars they had left on my spirit over the years. By the end of the second year, I had successfully gained control over nearly 30% of the Miller Group's outstanding debt through various anonymous holding companies. Austin was still blissfully unaware that the ground beneath his feet was shifting while he continued to brag about his upcoming architectural masterpieces to anyone who would listen. Every time a bank pressured him for a payment, he would simply borrow more money from another source, without realizing that the new source was ultimately reporting back to me. I watched the financial data stream across my monitors with a sense of cold satisfaction because the arrogance of the Miller men was finally becoming their greatest liability. They were so busy maintaining the illusion of wealth that they completely failed to notice that their walls were being systematically dismantled from the inside out. The complexity of the San Francisco financial market allowed me to hide my movements with such precision that even Dad's most trusted accountants couldn't trace the origin of the debt buyouts. I intentionally targeted the specific assets that Grandmother Lorraine had warned me about during our secret lessons in her private study years ago. Austin began to show signs of extreme stress during televised interviews, yet he refused to admit that his aggressive expansion was a complete failure. Savannah continued to spend lavishly on social media campaigns to distract the public from the reality that the Miller name was rapidly losing its luster among the elite. I knew that the foundation of their world was already rotting, while the rest of society was still mesmerized by the shiny gold leaf they had applied to the surface. Leo eventually brought me a folder containing the most damning evidence yet regarding Austin's personal misappropriation of corporate funds to cover his gambling debts in Reno. We realized that the Miller Group was no longer a stable entity but a sinking ship that was only staying afloat because of the lies my brother was telling our parents. I chose not to leak the information to the press immediately because I wanted to wait until the impact would be absolutely devastating to their reputation. The silence I maintained during those 5 long years was not a sign of weakness, but a strategic choice to ensure that my eventual return would be final and absolute. Every step I took in the shadows brought me closer to the day when I would no longer be the invisible daughter but the master of their collective fate. The gray fog clinging to the jagged peaks around Lake Tahoe seemed to swallow the cemetery during the funeral for Lorraine, while my family stood in a practiced circle of grief. Austin looked more interested in checking the gold watch on his wrist than paying his final respects to the woman who had built our entire foundation. Savannah leaned against him with a bored expression, while her eyes darted around the mourners as if she were already calculating the net worth of every person in attendance. We moved from the cold wind of the burial site to the heavy silence of Dad's private study, where the family attorney was waiting with a thick stack of legal documents. I sat in the furthest corner of the room, while keeping my face a mask of indifference because I knew that the real theater was about to begin. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading the final wishes of Lorraine, while the tension in the room became thick enough to choke the air. Austin leaned forward with a greedy glint in his eyes while waiting to hear the confirmation that he was now the sole master of the Miller Group. When the lawyer announced that Austin would inherit the main estate and the majority of the corporate shares, Savannah let out a sharp sigh of relief that echoed off the mahogany walls. My parents nodded in approval as if this were the only logical outcome for the family legacy, while they completely ignored my presence at the back of the room. I waited patiently for the mention of my name, while knowing that the modest gift Lorraine had left me would be the spark for their inevitable cruelty. When the lawyer finally reached the section concerning my inheritance, he stated that I was to receive the deed to a specific parcel of land on the northern edge of the lake. Savannah burst into a sharp laugh that was completely devoid of any genuine humor, as she realized that the property was nothing more than a swampy marsh. She turned toward me with a mocking sneer and remarked that it was fitting for the family outcast to be given a piece of useless dirt that couldn't even support a shed. Austin joined in the ridicule by stating that Lorraine must have finally lost her mind during her final days if she thought that land held any value at all. They viewed my inheritance as a final insult from beyond the grave while they remained blissfully unaware of the strategic importance of that specific coordinate. Dad stood up and walked over to the desk with a cold authority that demanded absolute obedience from everyone in the room. He slid a heavy document across the table toward me and firmly instructed me to sign a formal waiver of any future claims to the family business. He made it very clear that the land was my only consolation prize and that I was never to set foot in the corporate offices again. Mom looked at me with a weary disappointment while she urged me to just sign the papers so that the family could move forward without any more unnecessary drama. I picked up the pen without uttering a single word of protest because I wanted them to believe that they had finally defeated me. The silence in the study was only broken by the scratch of my signature on the parchment, while Savannah continued to whisper jokes about my new life as a swamp owner. Austin was so busy patting himself on the back for securing the family shares that he didn't even bother to read the legal description of my new property. I felt the weight of the key in my pocket while knowing that the land they were laughing at was the only environmental buffer zone for his entire billion-dollar project. He had no idea that by letting me keep that marshland, he was effectively handing me the power to shut down his construction whenever I felt like it. I stood up and walked out of the house without looking back, while the sound of their arrogant laughter followed me into the chilly afternoon air. Exactly 2 months after the funeral, Austin finally realized the catastrophic mistake he had made when the State Environmental Board halted his latest luxury development. He discovered that the drainage rights and the required ecological buffer were legally tied to the very swamp he had mocked me for owning in front of the lawyer. Savannah's face turned a pale shade of gray when the realization hit them that they could not move a single ounce of dirt without my written permission. Dad tried to call me multiple times to negotiate a buyback of the land, but I made sure that every single one of his messages went straight to my deleted folder. They had spent years treating me like a worthless shadow, and now they were finally discovering that the shadow had the power to eclipse their entire sun. Exactly 1 week had passed since Austin threw my belongings into the snow before the Miller Group headquarters began to resemble a sinking ship in the middle of a violent storm. The State Environmental Agency had issued an emergency injunction to halt all construction on the Blue Tahoe project due to the lack of a proper ecological buffer zone. Austin was facing a catastrophic financial collapse because his entire capital reserves were tied up in a development that could no longer move forward without my marshland. He had spent the last few days frantically trying to find a legal loophole, while Savannah attempted to use her social connections to bribe the local zoning officials into granting an exception. Her efforts were met with cold rejection because every regulatory path led directly back to the private deed that I now held in my possession. Austin finally reached a breaking point and decided to seek a meeting with the mysterious principal of the investment firm that had been aggressively buying up his corporate debt. He arrived at the glass-walled skyscraper in downtown San Francisco with a desperate hope that he could negotiate a bridge loan to save his failing reputation. Savannah accompanied him in her most expensive designer suit while practicing a forced smile that she intended to use to charm the anonymous creditor. They were made to wait in the lobby for over an hour while several financial journalists gathered outside to document the impending bankruptcy of the Miller dynasty. Austin kept adjusting his tie with shaking hands while he practiced a speech about family legacy and the importance of supporting local business leaders. The secretary finally ushered them into the top floor executive suite, where I was sitting behind a massive oak desk with my back turned toward the entrance. Austin began his rehearsed plea by stating that his company was merely facing a temporary liquidity issue and that a partnership would be mutually beneficial for both parties. He promised a massive return on investment once the environmental hurdles were cleared, while Savannah added that the Miller name was a gold standard in Nevada real estate. I slowly rotated my chair to face them while maintaining a chillingly calm expression that made the blood drain instantly from Austin's face. He stood there in absolute silence for several seconds before his voice finally cracked as he whispered my name in total disbelief. The realization that the sister he had treated like garbage was now his primary creditor seemed to paralyze him where he stood. Savannah tried to regain her composure by demanding to know what kind of sick game I was playing by hiding my success from the rest of the family. I ignored her outburst and looked directly at Austin while sliding a folder containing the notice of default across the polished surface of the desk. I told him that the time for negotiation had ended years ago when he chose to destroy my projects for his own amusement, and that I had no intention of saving him now. He began to beg for mercy by claiming that Mom and Dad would be devastated if the family lost everything, but his words felt hollow and meaningless to me. I stood up and informed them that my firm would be initiating the formal foreclosure process on the Lake Tahoe estate, starting at 9 o'clock the following morning. Austin attempted to scream at me about family loyalty while Savannah tried to lunge across the desk in a fit of hysterical rage. I pressed a button on my intercom to summon the security team, who had already been briefed on how to handle such a predictable display of hostility. Two large men in black suits entered the room and firmly gripped Savannah's arms, while she shrieked insults about my character that echoed through the entire hallway. Austin followed behind them in a daze while looking like a man who had just witnessed the total destruction of his entire world in a single afternoon. The scene in the lobby was a total nightmare for the Miller pride, as the guards forcibly escorted Savannah toward the main exit in front of dozens of flashing cameras. The financial news outlets were already broadcasting the footage of the disgraced socialite being kicked out of the very building that held her husband's fate. Austin tried to hide his face from the reporters while the guards made it very clear that neither of them would ever be welcome on my property again. I watched from the window as their limousine was swamped by the media, while knowing that the public humiliation was only the beginning of their long descent into poverty. They had spent their lives making sure I felt small and insignificant, but now they were the ones who were being discarded like yesterday's trash. 3 days had passed since the massive financial collapse of the Miller Group before the local authorities arrived at the Lake Tahoe estate to execute the formal asset seizure orders. I watched through a remote security feed as several black government SUVs pulled into the driveway to serve Austin with the final eviction notices. The once pristine lawn was now cluttered with bank representatives who were busy slapping bright orange foreclosure stickers onto every luxury vehicle and piece of heavy machinery. Austin stood on the front porch with a hollow expression while he watched his fleet of European supercars being loaded onto flatbed tow trucks. He tried to argue with the federal agents about his rights as a property owner, but his words were quickly silenced by the cold reality of a court-mandated bankruptcy filing. The legal troubles for my brother did not stop with the loss of his physical assets, because a team of investigators had already uncovered evidence of systemic environmental fraud. Austin was now facing multiple felony charges for falsifying soil reports and knowingly bypassing state regulations to accelerate the construction of his failing resort. His lead attorney had already abandoned him after realizing that there was no liquid capital left to pay for a credible legal defense team. I received a private report from my firm indicating that the district attorney was also looking into Austin's unauthorized use of corporate funds to cover his personal debts. He was no longer the brilliant developer he pretended to be, but a desperate man facing the very real possibility of spending several years in a federal penitentiary. Savannah wasted no time in protecting her own interests the moment she realized that the lavish lifestyle she loved was disappearing forever. She contacted a high-profile divorce lawyer and filed the paperwork before the ink was even dry on the bankruptcy documents. I was informed by a contact at the local airport that she attempted to flee the state with 2 suitcases filled with stolen jewelry and designer accessories. She was intercepted by the police near the private terminal while she was trying to board a chartered flight to a non-extradition country. Savannah shrieked about her status and her rights, while the officers calmly handcuffed her and began cataloging the stolen items as evidence for an upcoming grand larceny trial. Mom and Dad were forced to witness the total destruction of their social standing as the bank employees began clearing out the family's private collections. They had spent decades building a facade of untouchable wealth, but now they were being ushered out of their home with nothing more than a few boxes of personal belongings. My parents were relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of town where the elevators rarely worked and the hallways smelled of stale grease. Dad sat in a plastic chair in their new living room while staring at the peeling wallpaper in a state of catatonic shock. He had lost everything he worked for because he had placed all his trust in the son who was too arrogant to see the disaster coming. The most painful part of this transition for Mom was the realization that she could no longer hide behind her expensive charities or social clubs. She spent her first night in the new apartment weeping while she looked through old photographs of the gala events they used to host at the Tahoe Villa. Mom eventually found the courage to call me on a burner phone to express a level of regret that felt decades too late to be meaningful. She admitted that they had been blinded by Austin's false promises and that she deeply regretted the way they had treated me throughout my childhood. I listened to her sobbing for several minutes without offering a single word of comfort because her hoi-han did not change the years of neglect I had endured. The reality of their new life began to set in when the first utility bills arrived and they realized they had no way to pay for even the most basic necessities. Austin had spent every last cent of the family's emergency reserves to fund his reckless expansion, and Savannah had drained the remaining offshore accounts before her arrest. My brother was now forced to stay in a cheap motel while he awaited his first court appearance, because Dad refused to let him into the new apartment. The Miller name, which was once a symbol of power and prestige in the state of Nevada, was now being used as a cautionary tale in business schools. I watched the news reports of their downfall with a sense of grim finality because the cycle of arrogance had finally reached its inevitable and devastating conclusion. The quiet tension of my Friday morning was shattered when Mom launched a desperate and calculated smear campaign against me across every major social media platform. She posted a series of tearful videos from her new cramped apartment while claiming that I had heartlessly engineered the financial ruin of my own flesh and blood. Austin appeared on a local morning news segment later that hour to play the role of a grieving victim who had been swindled out of his grandmother's land by a greedy and vengeful sister. He looked directly into the camera with practiced sorrow while telling the public that I had manipulated Lorraine in her final moments to steal the family's most valuable assets. Within hours, a massive wave of online vitriol began to surge toward me as thousands of strangers branded me a traitor and a disgrace to the Miller name. The public outcry grew even more intense as Savannah's friends from the socialite circles began sharing fabricated stories about my alleged history of unstable behavior and corporate theft. I spent the afternoon watching the notifications on my phone explode with death threats and demands for me to return the stolen property to my destitute parents. My firm's reputation was being dragged through the mud by people who didn't know the first thing about the reality of the Miller Group's illegal business practices. Austin was successfully painting a picture of a golden son who had been betrayed by a hidden viper, while the internet celebrated his perceived bravery in the face of my cruelty. They truly believed that they could use the court of public opinion to shame me into surrendering the leverage I had worked for 15 years to acquire. I remained perfectly calm during the entire ordeal because I had already anticipated their move and had spent the previous night preparing a devastating digital response. I contacted Leo and instructed him to release the encrypted files containing the high-definition security footage from the night I was kicked out into the snow. The video clearly showed Austin laughing while he tossed my suitcase onto the frozen driveway, and Savannah mocking my lack of a home as the doors were slammed in my face. We also uploaded a series of audio recordings from the will reading where Dad and Mom were heard celebrating the fact that they had left me with a useless piece of swampland. The contrast between their televised lies and the cold reality of their recorded actions was enough to make the collective jaw of the internet drop in absolute shock. The narrative began to shift with incredible speed, as the very people who had been attacking me suddenly turned their fury toward the Miller family's blatant hypocrisy. Leo then facilitated a live stream where my attorney, who was also my oldest confidant from San Francisco, officially served Austin and Mom with a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit. He explained to the thousands of viewers that my family had not only engaged in mental abuse for decades, but were now actively committing character assassination to cover up their own financial fraud. My legal team made it very clear that we would be seeking maximum damages for the emotional distress and the professional harm caused by their coordinated social media attack. The public's sympathy evaporated instantly as they realized that Austin was not a victim, but a predatory bully who had finally met his match. Austin tried to issue a frantic retraction of his statements on the evening news, but the journalists were no longer interested in his rehearsed apologies or his fake tears. He was met with a barrage of questions about his environmental fraud and the misappropriation of company funds that had been leaked alongside the family videos. Savannah was forced to disable all of her social media accounts because the comment sections were flooded with people demanding she return the jewelry she had tried to steal during her arrest. Dad and Mom found themselves completely isolated in their small apartment, while the neighbors began to recognize them as the villains from the viral evidence. The Miller family had attempted to use the world as a weapon against me, but they had only succeeded in creating a target on their own backs. By the time the sun went down on that Friday evening, the legacy of the Miller Group had been permanently stained by the truth of their own recorded cruelty. Every single influential contact who had previously supported Austin began to issue public statements distancing themselves from his toxic and illegal behavior. I sat in my office with Leo while watching the statistics show that my family's social standing had reached a level of absolute zero from which they would never recover. They had spent years trying to make me invisible, but now the entire world was watching every single one of their desperate and pathetic moves. The counterattack was more effective than any lawsuit because it took away the one thing they valued more than money, which was their undeserved reputation. 6 months had passed since the final gavel fell on the Miller Group's bankruptcy proceedings, while I stood on the quiet shoreline of Lake Tahoe to breathe in the crisp morning air. The legal battles were finally over, and the chaotic noise of the media circus had faded into a peaceful silence that I had earned through years of patient calculation. I looked across the deep blue water toward the northern parcel of land that had once been the source of so much mockery and arrogance from my family. The marshland was no longer a symbol of their contempt, but the centerpiece of a newly established nature conservancy that I had funded with the proceeds from selling off their seized assets. I felt a profound sense of closure as I watched the local wildlife return to the reeds, without the threat of a luxury resort destroying their natural habitat. The final consequences for Austin were far more humbling than a simple loss of wealth, because he was now required to perform hundreds of hours of manual community service. I recently saw a photograph of him wearing a fluorescent safety vest while picking up trash along the very highway where he used to speed in his Italian sports cars. He was forced to take a low-paying job as a construction laborer just to afford a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. Savannah had disappeared from the social scene entirely after her short jail sentence, while rumors suggested she was working at a mundane retail job to pay off her remaining legal fees. They were finally experiencing the reality of hard work and anonymity, while the world moved on as if the Miller dynasty had never existed in the first place. The silence of my new life was interrupted only once by a final and desperate phone call from Dad, who sounded like a broken man grasping at straws. He spent several minutes pleading with me to reconsider my position, while asking for a monthly allowance to help him and Mom maintain some level of comfort. He tried to use the bond of family as a leverage point by reminding me of the house I grew up in and the traditions we once shared during the holidays. I waited for him to finish his rehearsed speech before I calmly told him that the daughter he knew had died the night they threw her out into the cold. I disconnected the call without waiting for a response and blocked his number forever, because I refused to allow their toxic presence to poison my future ever again. My newfound freedom was not just about the millions of dollars in my bank account, but about the absolute lack of any emotional obligation toward people who never truly valued my worth. I spent my days working on sustainable development projects in San Francisco, while surrounded by a team of professionals who respected my vision and my intellect. Leo remained my most trusted advisor while we continued to build an empire that was based on transparency and ethical growth rather than the lies of my father's generation. I finally understood that true power does not come from the titles we hold or the houses we own, but from the ability to walk away from anyone who dares to diminish our spirit. The Miller name was a heavy chain that I had finally shattered to create a legacy that was entirely my own. This journey has taught me several vital lessons about self-respect and the necessity of establishing firm boundaries, even with those who share our blood. I learned that patience is the ultimate weapon when dealing with arrogant people who believe they are untouchable because of their temporary social standing. We must never allow the labels that others place upon us to define our potential or our path toward success in this unforgiving world. True family is not always found in a biological connection, but in the people who stand by us when we have nothing left to offer but our integrity. It is often necessary to burn the bridges that lead back to a toxic past so that we can build a stronger foundation for a future filled with peace and genuine purpose. I want to express my deepest gratitude to all of you for following my story through its darkest moments and its eventual triumphs over the shadows of the past. Your support has been a constant source of strength while I navigated the complex web of betrayal and corporate warfare that defined my life for 15 years. I hope that my experience serves as a reminder that it is never too late to reclaim your power and rewrite the ending of your own narrative. I would love to hear your personal thoughts and perspectives on these events in the comment section below this video. Please share your own stories of overcoming adversity or setting boundaries so that we can continue to inspire each other to live with courage and absolute self-belief. 41.